Hey everyone, my name is Ollie, but first, I want to ask you all a little question. What would you hear if you held a pair of scissors up to your ear? The sound of metal! Whoa! It just so happens that that's the film I want to talk about right now. The Sound of Metal was directed by Darius Marder and released in 2019. The drama follows protagonist Ruben, portrayed by Riz Ahmed, a dedicated drummer and recovering addict in a heavy metal band with his longtime girlfriend Lou, played by Olivia Cook. The catalyzing moment that directs the events of the story occurs when Ruben suddenly begins to lose his hearing and must navigate his love for music, his partner, and ultimately his past life in the hearing world, with his future as someone belonging to the deaf community. In particular, I want to discuss the intentional anti-ableist ideology enciphered by Marder into the text, specifically the emerging belief that having disability is not something to fix. This belief is mainly endorsed by Marder in his film to educate a hearing-abled audience that may ignorantly view disability or deafness with a deficit lens attitude. Marder fundamentally constructs his film around the Save the Cat story-beat structure, a narrative plotting method devised by Hollywood screenwriter Blake Snyder. In the 11th beat of the story, named Consequences and Casualties, founder of the deaf community Joe, portrayed by Paul Raci, exiles Ruben from the community for undergoing surgery to acquire cochlear implants, enabling him to once again be submerged into his old life, the hearing community.
Ruben, as you know, everybody here shares in the belief that being deaf is not a handicap, not something to fix. It's pretty important around here. All these kids, all of us, need to be reminded of it every day. And my house is a house built on that belief and built on trust. And when that trust is violated, things happen. And I can't have that. There are too many others to consider. And so, in your current state, at this time, I'm gonna have to ask you to pack up your bags today and find another place to be, Ruben.
In this exile of the protagonist, Marder sets up the narrative convention of Dark Night of the Soul. This is done to similar effect in Bob Ryder's The Princess Bride, in which love interest and protagonist Wesley is captured by antagonist Prince Humperdinck, and Buttercup is forced into an engagement with the prince. The Dark Night of the Soul convention signals the beginning of the protagonist's spiral into the darkest period of their life, or the rock bottom beat of their character arc. During the scene, Marder constructs a narrative convention of cause and effect to symbolize to the hearing audience that disability is not something to fix, through aid of symbolic codes, lighting, and blocking. Marder places Ruben and Joe far apart from each other at the table, creating a psychological, silent tension between the two characters' conflicting desires, and symbolizing the disconnection in both their contrasting views surrounding Ruben's attempt to belong to the hearing community again and, quote, fix his disability. Marder synonymously achieves this with long pauses in between the spoken dialogue, communicating the dissonance between the two characters. Marder's use of cool tone, dark lighting here communicates to a hearing audience the largely negative, emotionally draining effect Ruben's decision has upon both his and Joe's respective mental states. Marder uses an explicit written code in the form of dialogue to further construct this narrative, as Joe states plainly to Ruben his belief that
being deaf is not a handicap, not something to fix.
Marder additionally utilizes the symbolic code of costuming to emphasize in Ruben's black hoodie and beanie that he has hit a low point in his life, the darkness symbolizing Ruben's turbulent psyche, while his oversized clothing symbolizes his state of attempting to hide his true self, leading the hearing audience to believe that this decision to get surgery was not one that truly reflects his ultimate happiness as a person. In Marder's use of the narrative convention setting, he further showcases Ruben's emotional turbulence following the physical consequences of his decision, through starkly contrasting environments before and after Ruben's exile. Before his exile communicated, throughout almost every shot in the house, a window flooding warm-toned sunlight upon the subject of the frame is present, symbolizing a sense of peaceful clarity for Ruben in his newfound community, while representing to the audience that this place and its prioritization of joyful deaf culture is preferable over the clatter of the hearing world. Marder manipulates his comforting lighting scheme immediately after the scene where Ruben is exiled, in which the setting uses an isolating, low-key lit motel room with stormy grey natural lighting, of which causes Ahmed's figure to be shadowed, symbolizing Ruben's dark emotional state to the audience following his exile. The contrasting bright and lively versus the dark and isolated set before and after Ruben's exile symbolizes to the hearing audience the consequences of Ruben's deficit attitude towards his deafness. Though done with empathetic intentions, Marta's decision to completely negatively stereotype cochlear implants is not entirely accurate, according to various reviews of the film written by deaf people. As deaf writer and YouTuber Ahmed Khalifa mentions,
if you want hearing aids or cochlear implants, it's a personal decision. Nobody should be forced into it. Nobody should be discouraged. It's a personal thing. I don't frown upon it. I don't disagree with it. It's a personal thing.
The cultural event of the implementation of Rose's Law in 2010, signed by then President Barack Obama, which shifted the language used to refer to some people with disabilities from deficit-based, mental, I don't want to say that word, but it's there on the screen, to non-deficit-based intellectual disability, may have influenced the hearing audience's positive and largely welcoming reception of the film's condemnation of a deficit-lensed outlook upon disability. Furthermore, the ongoing cultural evolution of society preferencing the social model of disability, a model that recognizes people with disabilities face societal barriers that are in need of being fixed, over the medical model of disability, a model that tells people with disabilities that they individually are in need of being fixed, positively influenced a hearing audience's reception of this anti-ableist ideology. This positive consumption of the film is furthered by Marta's distribution of the text with burnt-in open captions, which puts the onus on institutions like cinemas and theatres to accommodate people with disabilities, instead of leaving it up to people who are deaf to accommodate themselves. Much how like Ruben feels he needs to fix himself with cochlear implants inside of metal, because his heavy metal lifestyle and the hearing community surrounding it is not accommodating of his deafness. As Khalifa mentions,
by having this caption the way it was done, it allowed everyone to be able to expose to the story and follow along and just have that same journey as those who can hear what everyone is hearing.
Whoa, that was a mouthful. I actually forgot to ask the second question that's been on my mind lately. What would you hear if you held a kebab up to your ear? I think you would hear the Silence of the Lambs. This psychological thriller was released in 1991 and directed by Jonathan Demme. The film follows FBI cadet Clarice Starling, portrayed by Jodie Foster, who must seek help from guileful cannibalistic serial killer Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, in order to catch another serial killer named Buffalo Bill, played by Ted Levine, who skins and wears his female victims. Fun times! Now, I specifically want to Hannibal lecture you on the transphobic ideological stance encoded by Demme into his film, which is the belief that trans-feminine individuals are predatory and disturbing. This dominant ideology is implied by Demme in an attempt to feed the prevalent fears of conservative American society during the 1990s, a society taught by Western media to feel afraid of trans-feminine individuals. This belief is established and constructed within the characterization of the main antagonist of the film, Buffalo Bill, or James Gumb, particularly within the scene in which he applies makeup and dances naked in front of a camcorder located in his lair. During the scene, Demme uses the convention of parallel editing to establish a disconcerting, frightening tension in shots of Gumb happily partaking in feminine hobbies, interrupted by dimly lit, high-angled, vulnerable shots of kidnapped character Catherine, portrayed by Brooke Smith, screaming and hyperventilating in a deep, musty pit. The disturbing nature of this obviously frightening violence perpetrated by Gumb is heightened in Demme's creative decision to use suffocating close-ups from revealing Gumb's adopted feminine attributes in the scene through use of symbolic codes, hair, makeup, and costuming, such as Gumb's eyeshadow and eyeliner wearing, his effeminate nipple ring, long blonde hair, and necklaces. In detailing Gumb's adopted femininity in a violent and disturbing setting, Demme follows the tradition of villainizing trans people in media, associating trans femininity with aggressive and predatory behavior. As Lindsay Ellis puts it in her video essay titled Tracing the Roots of Pop Culture Transphobia,
Bill is presented as a deviant and coded hideously queer, a gay man who lisps and cavorts around his dungeon basement, listening to Goodbye Horses and carrying around a poodle named Precious. The framing suggests that Bill is monstrous not so much through his killing, after all, Lecter is a killer too, but because he's a man who sews, wears makeup, and desires a sex change operation.
Demme further uses close-up upon written code to force uneasiness upon a conservative audience in the presence of a transgender character.
Who do you fuck with?
Come on, take that bow. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on.
Fuck with.
The dialogue is transparently unsettling, as no person would want to have anything sexual to do with this killer, and his rhetorical question comes off as predatory and associates his simultaneous feminine lipstick application with such behavior. Demme furthers the predatory mood constructed in the scene through forcing the audience to adopt the point of view of the camcorder, of which Levine uses the performance convention of breaking the fourth wall to make the audience feel uneasy. Furthermore, in pre-production of the film, actor Levine quoted that he hung out in transvestite bars speaking to patrons and performers to get a handle on his character, proving that the character of Gumb was at least partially based off of and constructed through real transgender identities. Demme further characterizes James Gumb as a transgender character in the way in which he participates in the action of tucking, a common practice for transfeminine individuals whereby an individual hides the crotch bulge of the penis and testicles so they are not conspicuous through clothing. This symbolic code of body manipulation, along with the predatory mood constructed by Demme in the shots prior, forces his conservative audience to believe that this sort of behaviour, which would now be classed as gender dysphoria, is dysfunctionally disturbing. Demme's decision to transgenderify his chief antagonist feeds into a long institutional trend that society consuming cinema in the 1990s would be firmly acquainted with. Films like Shay's Strip to Kill, Henkel's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, and Hitchcock's Psycho all construct the conventional horror genre-born trope of the disturbed trans-feminine killer. This trope was most commonly used by media makers in response to evolving transgender identities which began to gain mass media visibility around the 1950s in response to the first transgender woman to legally undergo sex reassignment surgery.
A 26-year-old ex-GI arrives home from Denmark where doctors converted him into a woman.
Though transgender identities were and are harmless, the trope projected late 1900s society's inability to fully accept new systems of thought onto transgender people, imprinting their confusion upon innocuous transfeminine individuals in order to feed and reflect their own fears surrounding ideological and subsequent societal evolution. Although a smaller, younger generation were beginning to think more positively about trans identities, even sparking a gay activist-led protest at the film's 5 Oscar sweep night, ending in 10 arrests, Western society had little to no positive media representation of transgender individuals at the time of the film's release, which meant that this negative representation of transfemininity in James Gunn was read by a dominant conservative audience as a blueprint for all transgender identities. In Demme's misinformed inclusion of this transphobic ideology, he furthers a conservative audience's preconceived stigmatization of the LGBTQIA+ community following the AIDS pandemic during the 80s and early 90s. At the time of the film's release, LGBTQIA+ people, especially queer people assigned male at birth, like Gum, were associated as spreading a noxious virus through the clean community. Demme has both refuted and apologized for claims of transphobia in the character of Gum, claims especially originating from a critical reading of the dance scene. In a 2014 interview with the Daily Beast, Demme stated that it was his directorial failing that he did not find ways to emphasize the fact that Gum wasn't gay, but more importantly, he possessed extreme self-loathing and longed not to be himself anymore. While acknowledging that the serial killer wasn't intended to be trans, character styling pointing out that
there's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Does not undo its overall impression that transfemininity and disturbing behavior go hand in hand. As transgender writer Emily St. James put, intent is less important than the impact. And when people saw Silence of the Lambs, they didn't hear Buffalo Bill isn't trans. They saw a weirdo serial killer dancing around in women's clothes. These types of audience readings have dramatically risen since the 90s, largely due to transgender individuals from fast-evolving younger generations like Laverne Cox, Sarah McBride, and Elliot Page. The positive spotlight on these identities construct an overall positive and vibrant representation of transgender individuals in mass Western media, continually evoking a starker contrast to the negative portrayal of trans identities in the Silence of the Lambs. Furthermore, the political and cultural shift in language from labeling some trans individuals with gender identity disorder, a term denoting some sort of disturbance of mind to trans identities, to gender dysphoria in 2013, removing the medical stigma surrounding trans individuals, is particularly relevant to James Gunn's case, as the resources we have now would diagnose him with gender dysphoria in the place of some sort of predatory and abnormal psychological disorder that Demme stigmatizes in The Silence of the Lambs. That was a mouthful. After saying that, I'm gonna need
With some fava beans and a nice Chianti.